The clock tower had been silent for 30 years. No bells, no hands moving. Just a frozen moment everyone learned to walk past. Then one morning, a stranger rode into town. A cowboy with tired eyes, a quiet past, and no intention of staying. No one believed the tower could ever work again. No one believed he would either. But sometimes, the things everyone forgets are only waiting for someone to listen. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Santa Fe sat under a winter sun that looked warm only from a distance. Up close, the light was thin and pale, like it had been strained through dust and miles of open land before it touched anything human. The air carried that high desert bite, dry enough to chap lips in minutes, cold enough to make breath visible, and sharp enough to remind a traveler that comfort was never promised out here. Wind slid along the adobe walls and through narrow streets, slipping around corners with a restless, prowling impatience. Flags on porch posts snapped like they were arguing with the sky. Even the scent of the city, wood smoke, piñón, and something metallic from the rail lines, felt pared down to essentials, as if Santa Fe had long ago learned to pack light. Elias Crow rode in from the North Road at a steady pace that matched his temperament, not hurried, not lazy, simply deliberate. At 33, he had the kind of face that seemed carved rather than grown, high cheekbones, a strong jaw softened by a day or two of dark stubble, and eyes the color of weathered cedar, steady and hard to read until they weren't. His hat brim shaded most of what he didn't feel like offering the world. The cold had reddened his knuckles where his gloves ended, and his coat, brown, heavy canvas patched at one elbow, held the smell of saddle leather and long miles. He wasn't a large man, but he was built the way men are built when they spend their days doing work that doesn't care about excuses, lean, durable, all-purpose. His horse, a bay gelding with a calm, watchful gaze and a white sock on its left foreleg, moved with the quiet patience of an animal that had seen enough to stop being impressed by storms. Elias wasn't looking for trouble, and he wasn't exactly looking for salvation either. If he had a destination, it lived somewhere behind his ribs rather than on any map. He'd told himself he was only passing through. One more town, one more chance to trade a few, days of labor for a few nights indoors. He'd made a life out of that kind of arithmetic. But the desert had a way of nudging a person into the places they were trying not to visit. The outskirts of the city thinned into a tired railroad neighborhood where the buildings stood farther apart and the streets widened like the town was exhaling. Old track lines cut across the ground in dull stripes, and a scattering of warehouses sat quiet, their doors shut like mouths that had decided speaking wasn't worth it. There, in the center of a neglected square, rose a clock tower that didn't belong to the present. It was tall enough to be seen from several blocks away, built of dark timber and pale stone, its corners squared and stubborn. The clock face was enormous, rimmed in iron, and its hands were stopped at 7:17, as if time had simply taken offense and walked away. The tower leaned slightly, not in the dramatic way of imminent collapse, but like an old man with one bad knee who refused to sit down. A few pigeons perched beneath the clock's rim, their feathers puffed against the cold. Their heads twitched in quick, suspicious movements, like small, nervous priests guarding a silent altar. Elias's horse slowed without being asked. Animals noticed things before men admitted them. Elias followed the horse's attention upward and felt something settle in his chest, an old, familiar sensation, part curiosity and part grief, like hearing a song you used to love in a place you didn't expect to survive. He didn't believe in omens. He believed in weather, in worn rope, in the way a hinge squealed when it needed oil. And still, he found himself staring at that frozen time, as if it had been waiting specifically for him. A woman's voice drifted from nearby, sharp as the air. "Don't get ideas." Elias turned his head and saw a woman standing outside a narrow storefront that looked like it had once been a small station office. A hand-painted sign in the window read Henderson General Goods, though the paint was cracked and fading. The woman was in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with a sturdy build that suggested she carried more than groceries in her day. Her hair was dark brown, threaded with gray, pulled back into a practical knot. Her face had the kind of lines that came from squinting into sun and wind, and her eyes, hazel, bright, unblinking, held the wary humor of someone who'd spent years watching strangers arrive with plans and leave with regrets. Her coat was thick and plain, and her hands were tucked into her pockets like she didn't waste warmth on unnecessary gestures. "Ideas about what?" Elias asked, his tone mild, as if he truly hadn't noticed the tower looming over them both. "About fixing that." She nodded toward the clock with her chin, as if pointing was too generous. "Folks see it and think they're going to be the one to set it right. Like time's a stray dog they can whistle back." Elias's mouth tugged at one corner. "Maybe I like stray dogs," she snorted, a sound halfway between laughter and warning. "Then you'll fit right in with the tower. It's been begging for attention longer than most people can remember. Still bites." Elias tipped his hat, a gesture respectful enough to keep things civil but casual enough to avoid becoming personal. "Name's Elias." The woman studied him the way a person studies a cloud bank, deciding whether it carried rain. "Mara Henderson," she said. "I run what's left of the store. That tower runs what's left of the stories." "Stories make good currency," Elias said. "Only if you don't mind being paid in bad luck." Mara's gaze flicked to his horse, then back to him. "You passing through?" "That's the plan," Elias replied. The words came out automatically like a rehearsed line. He'd said them in a dozen towns. Sometimes it had even been true. Mara looked him over again, slower this time, noting the worn cuffs of his coat, the way his boots were scuffed but cared for, the calluses visible where his gloves didn't cover. "You can pass through and still freeze," she said. "Wind gets mean after sundown. If you need supplies, come in. If you need a job, I've got shelves that won't fix themselves." Elias glanced once more at the tower. "And if I need to climb a clock?" Mara's expression tightened, a subtle shift that suggested the joke landed too close to something real. "Then you'd better be the kind of man who doesn't mind meeting ghosts," she said, and her voice lowered as if the air might overhear. "Because that tower's full of them. People say the man who built it died up there. Some say he jumped. Some say he slipped. Either way, the town decided it was easier to stop listening than to find out what really happened." Elias held her gaze. He didn't flinch, but something in his eyes dimmed briefly, like a lantern turned down. "People do that," he said simply. Mara's face softened by a fraction, though she didn't offer comfort outright. "Yeah," she replied. "They do." Elias walked his horse closer to the base of the tower. The wood was weathered, splintered in places, the iron fittings rusted along the edges. The door to the tower was chained, but the chain looked more symbolic than secure, like someone had tried to make the place feel forbidden without committing to the work of truly locking it away. Near the threshold, someone had left a little pile of offerings, a dried bouquet tied with twine, a cracked pocket watch, a child's toy train missing a wheel. Not prayers exactly, more like apologies. He felt for a moment that strange contradiction of the West, a land so wide it could swallow loneliness whole, and yet small enough that grief still found a way to linger in public squares. Elias crouched and picked up the pocket watch. Its glass face was chipped, its hands stopped in their own private surrender. He turned it over in his palm and noticed initials scratched into the back, J.H., and something like a date worn nearly smooth. He set it back gently, as if returning it to a grave. Mara watched him from the storefront. She didn't interrupt. Whatever her warnings, she had the look of someone who understood that men like Elias didn't stop because they were scared. They stopped because something inside them had already chosen. A gust of wind swept through the square, lifting dust and old paper, rattling the tower's metal braces with a hollow clank. The frozen clock hands didn't move, but the sound made the tower feel less dead and more like a creature sleeping with one eye open. Elias straightened. His breath left a brief white cloud. He looked at the clock face again, that stubborn 7:17, and felt the faintest pull, as if the tower wasn't asking to be fixed, but asking to be heard. He glanced back to Mara. "You ever hear it tick?" she asked. Mara's lips pressed together. For a second she looked younger, like an old memory had reached up and tugged on her sleeve. "Once," she admitted, "years ago. Late at night. Thought I was imagining it. Next day it was silent again. like it regretted speaking. Elias nodded slowly. Sometimes that's how people are, too. Mara gave him a look that was half suspicion and half reluctant respect. You talk like a man who's lost something he can't name. Elias smiled faintly, humor flickering like a match in wind. I can name it, he said. Just don't like the sound of it out loud. For a moment, the square was still except for the wind and the soft shifting of his horse's hooves. Santa Fe, with its bright galleries and bustling streets, might as well have been another world. Out here, time had pooled and stagnated, and the clock tower stood as proof that a town could keep living, while part of its soul stayed stuck. Elias turned his horse toward Mara's store, not fully deciding anything, but stepping closer to the edge of whatever decision waited for him. As he approached, Mara stepped aside and held the door open with one hand, her posture practical, her face unreadable. Not welcoming, exactly. Not unkind either. More like someone making space for fate to walk through without admitting she believed in it. Elias led his horse to the hitching post and tied the reins, his fingers moving with quiet competence. He glanced once more at the tower, then followed Mara inside, leaving the wind to argue with the frozen hands of time. And in the square behind him, the clock tower stood patient and silent, like an old god pretending not to care who finally dared to look up. The bell over Mara Henderson's shop door gave a tired jingle as Elias stepped inside, a sound thin enough to suggest it hadn't been asked to announce anyone important in a long time. Warmth gathered around him slowly, not the sudden comfort of a fire roaring in a hearth, but the patient heat of a place that had learned how to survive winter without complaint. The shop smelled of dust, coffee grounds, and old paper, ledgers, maps, newspapers, stacked and restacked until history blurred into clutter. Wooden shelves leaned slightly under the weight of canned goods, rope coils, lanterns, and objects that no longer had clear names but still refused to be thrown away. Mara moved behind the counter with the ease of someone who knew every loose floorboard by heart. Up close, Elias could see the fine scar that ran from her left eyebrow into her hairline, pale against weathered skin. It looked old, the kind of mark that came from a sharp lesson learned young and never repeated. She noticed his glance and raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Before you ask, she said, it was a shelf, not a man. Elias smiled, the humor low and genuine. Shelves can be dangerous, he replied. They fall when you trust them too much. Mara snorted and poured coffee from a metal pot that had lost its shine sometime during the last century. She slid a chipped mug across the counter. On the house, she said. You look like you'd drink it even if it tasted like regret. Elias took the mug, the heat seeping into his hands, and nodded his thanks. He leaned against the counter, careful not to put his weight on it, as if instinct told him it might not forgive the pressure. Outside, the wind rattled the windows again, and somewhere beyond the walls, the clock tower groaned, a low wooden complaint that sounded almost like a sigh. You're not from here, Mara said, not as a question. No, Elias answered, but I've been to places like it. That's worse, she said. Means you'll think you understand us. He laughed quietly, a sound that stayed close to his chest. I don't understand much, he said. I just recognize patterns. Mara studied him for a moment longer, then turned her attention to a crate near the door. She nudged it with her boot. If you're staying the night, there's a room above the shop, not fancy. Stairs complain louder than the tower, but it's dry. Elias glanced up toward the ceiling, imagining narrow steps in a low bed, the kind that creaked if you moved too much or thought too hard. I don't need much, he said. That's what the last man said, Mara replied. He left a week later owing me for 3 nights and a broken window. Elias reached into his coat and set a few bills on the counter without ceremony. Mara eyed them, then pushed them back halfway. Pay when you decide to stay, she said. Or go. Elias didn't argue. He wrapped his fingers around the mug again and took a sip. The coffee was strong, bitter, and honest. He liked it. The shop door opened again, letting in a gust of cold and a man who seemed carved from the same wind. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard thick and iron gray, despite a face that couldn't have been more than 45. His nose bore the slight bend of something once broken and set without patience. He wore a long coat dusted with frost and moved with the careful stiffness of someone whose body remembered injuries, even when his mind pretended otherwise. "Evening, Mara," he said, voice gravelly but not unkind. His eyes flicked to Elias, assessing without hostility. "We got company?" "Passing through," Mara replied. "This is Tom Calder." Tom gave a nod that felt earned rather than polite. "Rail supervisor," he added, as if the title explained both his posture and his weariness, or what's left of it. Elias returned the nod. Elias Crow. Tom's gaze lingered on Elias's hands, the boots, the horse visible through the window. "You ride far," Tom said. "Far enough," Elias answered. Tom grunted approval. He set a small paper sack on the counter and winced slightly as he shifted his weight. "Tracks are clear tonight," he said to Mara. "Storm missed us by a mile, but the old line near the tower's acting up again. Woods creaking worse than usual." Mara's mouth tightened. "It always does when the temperature drops." Tom's eyes flicked toward the clock tower beyond the glass. "That thing's got a way of stirring trouble," he muttered, "like it doesn't want to be forgotten." Elias felt the words settle heavy and familiar. "Does it ever make noise?" he asked, careful to sound casual. Tom paused, then shrugged. "Wood shifts, metal complains. You spend enough time around dying things, you stop calling it strange." His beard twitched with a humorless smile. "But some nights," he added, quieter, "it sounds like something's moving up there. Not the clock, something else." Mara shot him a look. "You're not helping." Tom lifted his hands. "Just saying what's true." He turned back to Elias. "If you're the fixing type, there's always work here, but this town doesn't like being changed. It tolerates it at best." Elias considered that. Toleration's a start. Tom chuckled once and collected his sack. "Suit yourself." At the door, he paused. "Just don't climb the tower at night. People who do don't sleep right afterward." Then he was gone, swallowed by wind and darkness. Silence settled back into the shop, thick but not uncomfortable. Mara wiped the counter with a rag that had seen better decades. "Tom's harmless," she said. "Carries too many ghosts to be dangerous." Elias nodded. He knew the type. He was the type. Later, after Elias settled his horse and climbed the complaining stairs to the room above, the shop he found sleep came slowly. The bed was narrow, the blankets heavy with age. Outside, the wind rose again, dragging cold fingers along the walls. Somewhere near midnight, a sound threaded its way through the dark, not loud, not sharp, but deliberate. Tick. Elias's eyes opened. Tick. The sound wasn't coming from his room. It wasn't coming from the shop below. It came from outside, faint but steady, like a heartbeat that hadn't quite decided whether it was alive. Elias sat up, breath held, listening. Tick. He moved to the small window and peered out. The square lay pale under moonlight, empty except for drifting dust and the dark bulk of the clock tower. The hand still pointed stubbornly to 7:17. But beneath that frozen face, something shifted. A vibration ran through the wood, subtle but undeniable, as if a mechanism deep inside was testing itself, remembering how movement felt. Elias dressed quickly and slipped downstairs, careful not to wake Mara. Outside, the cold hit him like a slap, but he welcomed it. His boots crunched softly on gravel as he crossed the square. At the base of the tower, the air felt different, denser, charged, as if the structure held its own weather. He rested a gloved hand against the timber. It trembled faintly. "Easy," he murmured, unsure who he was speaking to. A shape moved near his leg. Elias looked down and found himself staring into the sharp, intelligent eyes of a dog. Medium-sized, lean, with a coat mottled gray and black like storm clouds, the animal stood alert but not aggressive. One ear was nicked, the scar small and clean. The dog's age was hard to guess, old enough to know better, young enough to stay curious. "Well," Elias said quietly, "you look like you belong to nobody." The dog's tail flicked once, cautious but hopeful. Elias straightened and looked back at the tower. The ticking had stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like a held breath. He crouched, again, and scratched the dog behind the ear. "You hear it too?" he asked. The dog sat, gaze fixed on the tower as if waiting for instructions. Elias stood there for a long moment, the cold creeping through his coat, the night pressing in. He realized then that this place wasn't asking to be repaired. It was asking to be understood. And understanding, he knew, always cost more time than a man planned to give. As he turned back toward the shop, the tower remained silent, but Elias could have sworn the frozen clock hands caught a glint of moonlight that hadn't been there before. Morning came to Santa Fe without ceremony. The sun rose pale and cautious, as if it remembered yesterday's cold and did not wish to promise warmth too quickly. Light spilled across the railroad square in thin layers, settling on the dust, the tracks, and finally the clock tower, which stood exactly as it had the night before, leaning, silent, its hands fixed at 7:17. If anything had stirred in the dark hours, the town gave no sign of noticing. Elias woke before Mara did. The narrow bed creaked when he sat up, a complaint sharp enough that he froze for a moment, listening for movement below. None came. He dressed quietly, his motions practiced from years of sleeping in places that were never quite his. Through the small window, he watched the square come back to life. A man sweeping the front of a warehouse, a woman pulling laundry from a line stiff with frost, a pair of children chasing one another between rail ties as if the ground itself were a game board. But Elias's eyes kept returning to the tower. Downstairs, Mara was already awake, her coat on, hair still pinned tight. She poured coffee and slid a plate with 2 eggs toward him without comment. Her generosity was efficient, unadorned. "You were up last night," she said finally, not looking at him. Elias paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Was I loud?" "No," Mara replied. "But the tower was." He met her gaze. Up close, her eyes were sharp but tired, like someone who had learned to stay alert even while resigned. "You heard it too," he said. Mara exhaled slowly. "I heard something. That doesn't mean I like admitting it." Elias nodded. "I didn't imagine it then." "No," she said. "You didn't." They ate in silence for a few minutes. The quiet wasn't strained. It felt more like an agreement not to rush what neither of them fully understood yet. "The dog," Mara said suddenly. "Did you see him?" Elias looked up. "You know him?" "Everyone knows him," she replied. "He's been around since before the tower stopped. Comes and goes. Never lets anyone get too close. We call him Ash. Looks like he walked through a fire once and decided not to bother cleaning up." Elias smiled faintly. "He was watching the tower." Mara's mouth tightened. "So was my husband," she said, and the words landed heavier than she probably intended. She turned away to rinse a mug, then leaned both hands on the counter as if steadying herself. "Before he died," she added, voice lower now, "Caleb spent more time up there than he did at home." Elias hadn't known Mara was married. He waited, letting the silence invite more if it would. "Caleb Henderson," she continued. "Tall man, broad shoulders, beard he never quite trimmed right, always uneven at the jaw, smelled like oil and old wood no matter how much soap he used." Her eyes softened despite herself. "He was the last official caretaker of the tower, not by title, just by habit." Elias listened carefully. This was not a story told often. "He fixed what he could," Mara said. "Wound the clock every morning. Claimed it kept the town honest. Then one winter something inside the mechanism gave way. Gear teeth stripped clean. The hands froze. Caleb went up to see what he could do and came down different." "Different how?" Elias asked. Mara searched for the word. "Quieter, like he'd heard something he couldn't unhear. He kept going back, even when there was nothing left to fix. Then, one night, he didn't come home." Elias felt the old, familiar weight press against his ribs. Loss, recognized loss. "They say he died up there," he said carefully. Mara nodded. "Heart gave out, that's what the doctor said. But I know that tower had something to do with it, not because it killed him." She shook her head. "Because it wouldn't let him stop listening." Outside, Ash appeared at the edge of the Sosetikut square, his gray-black coat catching the morning light. He sat and stared at the tower, tail wrapped neatly around his paws. Elias followed Mara's gaze. "You ever think about fixing it?" he asked. Mara laughed, short and humorless. "Every day, and every day I decide I like breathing." Elias didn't smile this time. What if it's already trying to fix itself? That earned him a look sharp enough to cut rope. "That's the kind of thinking that gets men killed," she said. Or keeps them alive, Elias replied softly. Later that morning, Elias found himself at the base of the tower again. Ash hovered nearby, close enough to suggest company, far enough to maintain dignity. The tower door stood chained, but the lock was old, its metal worn smooth by years of handling. Elias crouched and examined it. The craftsmanship was simple, honest. Whoever built it believed in things that lasted. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You don't pick locks," said a man, approaching from the tracks. "You persuade them." The man was in his late 30s, lean and angular, with a narrow face framed by a trimmed black beard that accentuated a sharp chin. His eyes were dark, restless, always moving, as if the world owed him something and he was determined not to miss the moment it paid up. He wore gloves despite the warming air, and his coat hung loose, hiding more than it revealed. "Name's Jonah Pike," the man added. "Used to work salvage. Now I work opportunity." Elias straightened slowly. "I wasn't picking anything." Jonah smiled, thin and knowing. "Not yet." Ash growled low in his chest, a warning rather than a threat. Jonah noticed and lifted his hand slightly. "Easy, friend. I don't bite unless paid." "What do you want?" Elias asked. Jonah glanced up at the clock face. "Same thing everyone does," he said, "to know what's worth saving." Elias studied him. Jonah moved like a man accustomed to other Yahweh. People's property. His confidence built not on strength, but on nerve. "And what do you think that is?" Elias asked. Jonah shrugged. "Depends who's asking. Some folks think that tower's full of scrap worth a fortune. Old gears, brass fittings. History melts down, real nice." Ash's growl deepened. Elias's voice stayed even. "And you?" Jonah's smile faded slightly. "Me? I think there's something wrong with it. Something that scares people enough to leave it alone, which usually means there's a story underneath." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Stories sell." Elias met his gaze, unblinking. "Some stories don't belong to men like you." Jonah's eyes hardened. "Careful, cowboy. Towns like this don't protect strangers." Elias smiled then, but there was no humor in it. "Neither do towers." Jonah hesitated, weighing something unseen, then stepped back. "Suit yourself," he said. "But if you're thinking of climbing up, there, you won't be alone for long." He turned and walked away, boots crunching against gravel, leaving behind the faint scent of tobacco and ambition. Elias exhaled slowly. He reached out and rested his palm against the tower door again. This time, he felt it clearly. A faint vibration, steady and patient, like a watch ticking inside a coat pocket. That afternoon, Mara found him sketching in a small notebook, rough diagrams of gears, notes about wear patterns, margins filled with question marks. "You're serious," she said. "I'm careful," Elias replied. "There's a difference." Mara crossed her arms. "Caleb was careful too." Elias looked up at her. Was he afraid? Mara considered. "No," she said at last. "He was curious." Elias closed the notebook. "So am I." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the square. The clock tower stood unchanged, but Elias sensed the difference now. Not in its shape or sound, but in the way it seemed to wait. And for the first time since riding into Santa Fe, Elias understood that leaving would be harder than staying. By the fourth morning, Santa Fe had grown accustomed to Elias Crow's presence in the square, though no one would have admitted it outright. Towns like this did not welcome change. They absorbed it slowly, the way dry earth absorbed rain, first resisting, then surrendering inch by inch. The cold had loosened its grip overnight, leaving behind a brittle calm. The sky stretched wide and colorless, the kind that made distance feel deceptive and time feel optional. Elias stood at the hitching post, tightening the cinch on his horse's saddle with practiced care. The bay gelding, named Holler for reasons Elias had never fully explained, flicked an ear back toward him. Holler was 9 years old, solid in the chest, with intelligent dark eyes and a scar along his flank from a barbed wire fence encountered years earlier. He was steady under pressure, but he disliked uncertainty, and lately his gaze kept drifting toward the tower with the same cautious interest Elias felt himself, trying not to acknowledge. "You'll be fine," Elias murmured, patting the horse's neck. "I won't be long." Holler snorted, unconvinced. Ash appeared from behind the general store, trotting with a loose, confident gait. In daylight, Elias could see the dog more clearly now. Ash was lean but not starved, ribs faintly visible beneath a thick mottled coat. His muzzle was beginning to gray, marking him at around 7 or 8 years old, an age where a dog had learned what survived and what didn't. One eye was rimmed with darker fur, giving him a perpetually skeptical look. He stopped a few feet away and sat, head tilted slightly, as if waiting to see whether Elias would make a foolish decision worth supervising. Elias exhaled and looked up at the tower. The chain was still there, so was the lock, but this morning the lock felt less like a barrier and more like a formality. Elias knelt, worked his fingers around the metal, and felt the subtle give of old craftsmanship, yielding to patience. The lock clicked open with a quiet finality that echoed louder in his chest than it did in the square. Ash stood. "You don't have to come," Elias told him. Ash ignored him. The inside of the tower smelled of oil, dust, and old rain trapped in wood. Light filtered through narrow slats, striping the interior in pale bands. The staircase wound upward in a tight spiral, steps worn smooth by decades of boots that had once climbed with purpose. Elias tested the first step. It held. He climbed. The higher he went, the cooler the air became, tinged with iron and something faintly sweet, like aged paper. Each step creaked, not in protest but in acknowledgement. This was not a structure unused to being climbed. It was one unused to being remembered. Halfway up, Elias paused. His breathing was steady, but his chest felt tight, not from exertion, but from a familiar pressure he'd learned to associate with decisions that couldn't be undone. He thought of Mara, of Caleb Henderson's quiet obsession, of Jonah Pike's sharp smile. He thought briefly of a woman far away whose name he hadn't spoken in years. Then he kept going. At the top, the clock mechanism filled the room like a skeleton made of brass and iron. Gears the size of wagon wheels meshed with smaller, more delicate components. Dust clung to everything, but beneath it, Elias saw intention. This was not the careless machinery of something thrown together. This was built by someone who believed time deserved respect. He moved closer, careful where he placed his weight. The main drive gear bore deep wear along its teeth, uneven, like a jaw that had chewed too long on one side. A secondary spring sagged slightly, metal fatigued but not broken. Elias touched it gently, feeling the faint vibration that had haunted his nights. "You're not dead," he murmured. "You're tired." Ash sat near the doorway, ears pricked, watching. Elias worked slowly, not fixing, not forcing, just understanding. He traced the path of motion that should have been there, noted where it failed. Caleb Henderson had likely seen the same thing years ago and lacked the one piece that made it make sense. Elias saw it now. A misalignment caused not by damage, but by a subtle shift in the tower's frame. The lean everyone ignored had been pulling the mechanism out of truth one fraction at a time. A man cleared his throat below. Elias stiffened, then relaxed when he recognized the voice. "Tom?" he called. Tom Calder stood at the bottom of the stairs, hat in his hands, beard catching the light from above. "Mara sent me," he said. "Said if you were going to fall, she'd prefer a witness." Elias smiled faintly. "Tell her I appreciate the thought." Tom climbed a few steps, stopping where the wood groaned louder. He peered up at the machinery with narrowed eyes. "Caleb talked about this," he said. "Said the tower was bending. Said fixing the clock. Wouldn't matter until you fixed the tower." "He was right," Elias replied. Tom scratched his beard. He didn't know how. "I might," Elias said. Tom studied him carefully. "You lose someone?" Elias didn't answer immediately. "I lost myself for a while," he said instead. "Turns out that's harder to replace." Tom nodded once. Men like him understood answers that weren't complete. "If you need lumber," he said, "or hands that don't ask questions, you come find me." Elias looked down at him. "I will." By the time Elias descended, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the square. A small crowd had gathered, not out of excitement, but out of habit. People paused, watched, then pretended they hadn't. Mara stood in her doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. When Elias emerged from the tower, dusted and quiet, she searched his face for signs of triumph or disaster. "Well?" she asked. "It's not ready," Elias said. "Neither am I." She studied him, then nodded. "That's the first sensible thing you've said." Jonah Pike lingered near the edge of the square, leaning against a crate as if he belonged there. His dark eyes tracked Elias with thinly veiled interest. "Find treasure?" Jonah called. Elias met his gaze, voice level. "Found work." Jonah smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That'll pass." "Maybe," Elias said. "Maybe not." That evening, as shadows stretched long and the wind softened, Elias sat on the steps of the tower. Ash lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes half closed. Holler shifted at the hitching post, content for now. The clock hands remained still, but Elias no longer felt mocked by their silence. Silence, he was learning, was not absence. It was waiting. For the first time in years, Elias Crow did not feel the urge to move on. The decision to stay rarely announced itself with clarity. More often, it arrived disguised as routine, hidden in the simple repetition of days that no longer pushed a man toward the road. For Elias Crow, staying began the morning after his climb, when he woke without the familiar itch beneath his skin, the one that usually whispered it was time to saddle up and disappear before roots could take hold. Santa Fe woke slowly that day. Clouds drifted low and heavy, flattening the sky into a dull sheet of gray that promised snow but delivered only cold. The wind was quieter, as if it too was listening. Elias stepped out into the square with a mug of coffee warming his hands and found Ash already there, sitting where the tower's shadow fell longest. The dog's posture was relaxed now, less watchful than before, as if he had decided Elias was not a temporary disturbance but a variable worth recalculating. "You still here?" Elias said softly. Ash flicked his tail once, neither agreeing nor denying. The tower loomed above them, unchanged in its silence, but Elias felt the difference anyway. Understanding had weight. Once carried, it altered balance. By mid-morning, Tom Calder arrived with a flatbed truck and 2 men from the rail crew. One was young, barely into his 20s, with a narrow frame and a patchy beard that suggested impatience more than maturity. His name was Lucas Reed, and he moved with the jittery eagerness of someone trying to prove he belonged among older men who had already learned not to rush. The other was older and thicker through the shoulders, with deep-set eyes and a permanent stoop from years of lifting more than his spine had approved. He introduced himself as Ben Holloway, spoke little, and listened like every word might one day matter. They unloaded timber near the tower, long beams salvaged from a collapsed freight platform. Elias directed them quietly, measuring distances with his eye, tapping the ground with his boot to mark where weight needed to shift. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain more than necessary. Somehow, that made the men trust him more. Mara watched from the doorway of her store, arms folded against the cold. She had not objected when Tom told her about the lumber. She had not encouraged it either. Grief taught people to ration hope carefully. "You're not fixing the clock," she said when Elias joined her briefly at the counter. "No," Elias replied. "I'm fixing what's pulling it crooked." She studied him, then nodded. "Caleb said something like that once." Her voice didn't waver this time. "I didn't listen." "You couldn't have," Elias said gently. "Not then." The first beam went in by afternoon. It was slow work, measured, deliberate. Elias climbed and descended the tower repeatedly, checking angles, testing resistance. Ash lay nearby, occasionally rising to circle the square before returning to his post. Holler shifted when Ma-tut. The hammering grew loud, but settled when Elias spoke to him, low and steady. As dusk approached, snow finally began to fall, not heavy but persistent, dusting the town in white and muting sound. The crew packed up, hands stiff with cold. Tom lingered. "You stay too long," Tom said. "People start expecting things." Elias wiped his hands on a rag. "I'm counting on it." That night, Elias ate supper alone in the room above the shop. The wind rattled the windows softly, less angry now. He sat at the small table, sketching again. Not the mechanism this time, but the square, the way the tower leaned, the way people moved around it. Patterns weren't just mechanical, towns had them too. A knock came at the door. Elias opened it to find Jonah Pike leaning against the frame, hat tipped back, expression casual. Up close, Jonah's face showed more wear than Elias had noticed before. Fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a faint scar at his jaw where a blade had likely. met resistance. He smelled faintly of tobacco and cold. "You're making a mess of things," Jonah said pleasantly. Elias stepped aside, not inviting him in, not barring him either. "I don't recall asking." Jonah shrugged. "Word gets around. Folks see lumber, see work, start thinking the tower belongs to them again. That kind of thinking complicates business." "Your business," Elias corrected. Jonah's smile thinned. "Everyone's business eventually." His eyes flicked past Elias, taking in the sparse room. "You planning to stay?" "For now." Jonah nodded slowly. "Careful, men who stay get buried." "So do men who run," Elias said. Jonah laughed quietly. "You sound like someone who's already lost." Elias met his gaze. "I sound like someone who knows what losing costs." For a moment, something unreadable crossed Jonah's face. Resentment, maybe, or recognition. Then it was gone. "I'll be around," he said. "Just in case you change your mind." He tipped his hat and left. Elias closed the door and stood there longer than necessary, listening to Jonah's footsteps fade. Late that night, the ticking returned. It was louder this time. Not steady, not rhythmic, but searching. Like a heart finding its way back into pace. Elias sat up, breath shallow, listening as the sound threaded through the tower and into the room, vibrating the glass just enough to be felt. Ash barked once from below. Elias pulled on his coat and went down into the square. Snow crunched underfoot. The tower loomed pale against the sky. He placed his hand against the timber again and felt it, movement, subtle but unmistakable. The new beam was taking weight. The lean had lessened by degrees, too small for the eye, but large enough for the mechanism to notice. "You're remembering," Elias murmured. The ticking slowed, steadied, then stopped. Elias stepped back, heart racing, and laughed softly despite himself. It wasn't joy exactly. It was relief, the kind that came when effort finally met response. From the edge of the square, Mara watched him, coat pulled tight, expression unreadable. When Elias noticed her, she approached slowly. "You heard it," she said. "Yes." Mara looked up at the clock face. "Caleb used to say the tower listened back if you treated it right." Elias nodded. He wasn't wrong. Mara exhaled, the sound catching slightly. "I'm not ready to hope," she said. "That's all right," Elias replied. "I am." The snow thickened, covering tracks, softening edges. Elias stood beneath the tower with Ash at his side, holler visible beyond, and felt the weight of staying settle into something solid. For the first time, the idea did not frighten him. The day the tower shifted for the second time, Santa Fe noticed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no groan loud enough to rattle windows, no visible lurch that sent people running. But those who passed the square felt it all the same. A subtle correction, like a body straightening after years of poor posture. The tower still leaned, but not as much. Its shadow fell differently now, longer in the morning, cleaner at dusk. The clock hands remained frozen, yet something beneath them had changed, and towns learned long ago to respect changes they couldn't name. Elias felt it before he saw it. He woke with the strange sensation that something he'd been carrying had shifted weight overnight. Outside, the air was colder again, the kind of cold that sharpened edges rather than dulling them. Ash waited at the foot of the stairs, tail thumping once when Elias appeared. The dog's coat was dusted with frost, his breath steady and calm. He had chosen his allegiance without ceremony. "You're early," Elias said. Ash stood and walked toward the square, assuming Elias would follow. By mid-morning, people had begun to gather, not to help, not yet, but to observe openly. A woman Elias hadn't seen before stood near the edge of the crowd, her posture straight, her coat buttoned tight despite the sun. She was in her early 40s, tall and angular, with sun-browned skin and hair pulled into a severe bun that suggested discipline rather than vanity. A badge glinted faintly at her hip. Sheriff Ann Morales had arrived. She watched the tower for a long moment before turning her attention to Elias. Her eyes were dark, assessing, the kind that measured consequences before intent. A thin scar traced her lower lip, the remnant of a life that had not always involved clean paperwork. "You're the man climbing around up there," she said. Elias nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "People are nervous," she continued. Nervous people look for someone to blame when old things start moving. I'm not moving it fast, Elias said, just enough to keep it from falling. Sheriff Morales considered that. That's what my father used to say about fences, she replied. Half the town still blamed him when cattle wandered. Mara stood nearby, arms folded, watching carefully. Tom lingered at the edge of the crowd, jaw set. Jonah Pike was nowhere to be seen. I don't want trouble, Elias said. Morales studied his face, the calm set of his jaw, the lack of bravado. Neither do I, she said. But trouble has a way of showing up when people think they're being left behind. She glanced at the tower again. You plan on finishing this? Yes. She nodded once. Then do it in daylight. And don't give anyone reason to think you're hiding something. Her gaze flicked briefly to the alley where Jonah often lingered. Some men thrive on unfinished business. With that, she stepped back, letting the town breathe again. Work resumed, slower now, more deliberate. Elias adjusted supports, checking measurements twice. Lucas and Ben followed instructions without complaint. Ash remained close, occasionally lifting his head when voices rose too sharply. By afternoon, clouds rolled in again, thick and low. The air grew heavy, pressing sound downward. Elias climbed the tower one more time to inspect the mechanism under its new alignment. The vibration was steadier now, less frantic. He felt it through the soles of his boots. That was when he smelled smoke. Not much, just enough to register as wrong. Elias froze, listening. Below, voices rose in confusion. He moved quickly, descending the stairs two at a time. Outside, a thin line of smoke curled from behind the tower, where old debris had been stacked for years. Jonah Pike stood there, a match dropping from his fingers into the dirt. Accident, Jonah said calmly, though his eyes were sharp, alert. Some fool left oily rags lying around. Ash lunged forward with a snarl, stopping inches from Jonah's leg. Elias stepped between them. Enough, he said, voice low. Jonah shrugged. Fire scares people, he said. They see smoke and think disaster. Thought you might want a reminder of what you're risking. Tom arrived then, face flushed, fists clenched. You get away from here, he growled. Sheriff Morales pushed through the gathering crowd, eyes taking in the scene in seconds. Jonah, she said. That's twice this week I've heard your name attached to trouble. Jonah lifted his hands. I was leaving. Good, she replied. Do it faster. Jonah's gaze locked briefly with Elias's, something bitter flashing there, fear maybe or resentment at a story slipping beyond his control. Then he backed away, melting into the crowd. The fire never caught. The rags smoldered and died. But the damage lingered in the way people whispered afterward, in the way some faces turned wary again. That evening, Elias sat alone on the tower steps, exhaustion settling into his bones. Holler grazed nearby, unbothered. Ash lay pressed against Elias's leg, a steady warmth. Mara approached quietly, carrying 2 mugs. She handed one to Elias without comment. You don't have to finish this, she said after a while. No one would blame you if you left. Elias watched the sky darken. I would, he said. Mara nodded slowly. Caleb stayed because he believed the tower held the town together, she said. I think he was wrong. She looked at Elias. I think it's people that do. Elias smiled faintly. Then maybe the tower just reminds them. That night, long after the square emptied, Elias climbed the tower again. Not to work, but to listen. The ticking returned, soft and even, not loud enough to alarm anyone but him. He placed his hand on the mechanism and felt it respond, steady and sure. Below, Santa Fe slept, unaware that it had already chosen a side. The morning the clock moved, Santa Fe woke to a sound it had not agreed to hear. It was not loud, it was not ceremonial. It was a single, clean click, metal finding its place after years of resistance. But sound carries differently in towns built on memory, and that small noise traveled farther than anyone expected. It slid beneath doors, through dreams, into kitchens where coffee had gone cold, waiting for nothing in particular to happen. Elias Crow was already awake. He had slept little, not from fear, but from anticipation, the kind that kept the body alert long after the mind asked for rest. Ash lay curled at the foot of the stairs, head on his paws, eyes half open. The dog had aged visibly over the weeks Elias had known him, not in body but in expression. There was less waiting now, more certainty. Ash no longer watched the tower as if it might disappear. He watched it like an old companion who had finally decided to speak again. Outside, the air was sharp and clear, the sky scrubbed clean by night winds. The cold cut through Elias's coat, but it was the good kind, the kind that reminded a man he was still capable of feeling. He crossed the square before anyone else arrived and stepped into the tower, closing the door behind him with care. Inside, the mechanism waited, steady and quiet, its vibration no longer frantic but resolved. Elias climbed to the top and rested his hand against the main drive gear. "You ready?" he asked, knowing full well that readiness was rarely mutual. He made one adjustment, just one. Not a repair, not a correction, an allowance, a concession to age and gravity and the way structures leaned after carrying too much for too long. The gear turned, slowly, deliberately. The minute hand shuddered, then moved forward a fraction of an inch. Dust fell like fine snow. Elias stepped back, heart pounding, breath shallow. He waited, nothing else moved. For a moment, disappointment flared, sharp and immediate. Then the second hand twitched, once, twice. It began to sweep, uneven but alive. Outside, the sound reached the square. Tom Calder stopped mid-step, wrench still in his hand. Mara froze in her doorway, fingers gripping the frame as if the building might drift away without her. Lucas let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. Ben Holloway simply removed his hat. The clock face above them changed, not dramatically, but undeniably. The hands moved past 7:17, leaving that frozen hour behind without ceremony. Someone whispered, "It's working." Someone else said, "About damn time." Jonah Pike stood at the far edge of the square, half hidden, his face pale beneath his dark beard. The look in his eyes was not anger now, but something closer to defeat, the quiet realization that a story had slipped out of his control. He turned away before Sheriff Morales noticed him and disappeared down the alley, carrying his ambitions with him. The clock did not ring. That surprised people more than the movement itself. Elias descended slowly, legs unsteady, mind racing. When he stepped into the square, the crowd parted without instruction. No one cheered, no one clapped. It wasn't that kind of victory. This was private, almost reverent. Mara reached him first. Up close, Elias could see her hands shaking. "It moved," she said unnecessarily. "Yes," Elias replied. She looked up at the tower, eyes shining with something dangerously close to hope. "Caleb never got to see this." "No," Elias said gently, but he knew it could happen. Mara swallowed hard and nodded. Sheriff Morales approached next. She removed her hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, and studied Elias with an expression that balanced authority and relief. "You did it clean," she said. "No panic, no damage." "It's not finished," Elias replied. "It'll need watching. Care. It's old." Morales smiled faintly. "So is this town." As the crowd dispersed, drawn back to routines now slightly altered, Elias remained beneath the tower. Ash pressed against his leg, tail wagging once, slow, deliberate. Holler shifted at the hitching post, ears forward, attentive. Animals understood these moments better than people did. They recognized balance when it returned. That afternoon passed quietly. The clock continued to move, steadying as hours went by. People checked it cautiously, then more openly. A woman adjusted her watch. A man laughed when he realized he was late. Time, it seemed, had resumed its old habit of being inconvenient. Elias returned to the tower as evening fell. He climbed not to fix, but to listen. The mechanism hummed now, not loudly, but confidently. It didn't need him the way it had before. That realization settled into his chest with a mixture of relief and loss. When he descended, Mara was waiting. "I made stew," she said. "You should eat." They sat together on the shop. Steps, steam rising from bowls balanced on their knees. The sky burned orange and violet at the horizon. The tower's shadow stretched long behind them, no longer crooked enough to look apologetic. "You could leave now," Mara said quietly. "You've done what you came to do." Elias considered that. The road still existed. It always would, but it no longer called to him with urgency. "I don't think I came to fix the clock," he said. Mara smiled. the expression soft and unguarded in a way Elias hadn't seen before. "No," she said. "I think you came to stop running." They ate in companionable silence. Later that night, as Santa Fe settled into sleep, the clock reached the hour. It rang once. The sound rolled across rooftops and into the desert beyond, deep and steady, carrying no command, no warning, only acknowledgement. The town did not wake in fear. Some people smiled in their sleep, others turned over, comforted by the simple fact of hearing something familiar again. Elias stood beneath the tower as the sound faded, Ash at his side, Holler breathing softly behind him. For the first time in a long while, time did not feel like something chasing him. It felt like something he could finally walk alongside. The first morning after the clock rang, Santa Fe woke differently. Not louder, not happier in any obvious way, just steadier, as if the town had finally decided what rhythm it preferred and committed to it without further debate. Coffee brewed on time. Doors opened when they were supposed to. Trains passed through without lingering, their whistles sharp and unapologetic. Time, once an abstract inconvenience, had returned to its old role as a quiet authority that nobody thanked but everyone obeyed. Elias Crow woke before the bell. The habit surprised him. For years, mornings had arrived like intrusions, unwanted reminders that another day required explanation. Here, they came gently. Light slid through the window above Mara's shop, pale and honest. Ash lay stretched along the doorway, belly rising and falling in a slow, satisfied rhythm. His coat had filled out in recent weeks, the sharp lines of survival softened by routine and reliable meals. He lifted his head when Elias stirred, tail thumping once against the floor as if to say, "Yes, you're still here. Good." Outside, Holler waited at the hitching post, breath steaming softly in the cool air. The horse had settled into town life better than Elias expected, his once wary gaze now tracking passers-by with mild curiosity rather than suspicion. The scar along his flank had faded into something more like a story than a wound. Age had taught him what mattered. Elias dressed and stepped into the square. The tower stood tall and quiet, its lean corrected just enough to suggest dignity rather than defiance. The clock face gleamed faintly in the early light. The hands moved smoothly now, unhurried, unconcerned with who noticed. Mara emerged from the shop a few minutes later, coat buttoned, hair pinned as usual. But her posture had changed. The tightness that once held her shoulders high had eased, replaced by something looser, more forgiving. "You're up early," she said. "So are you," Elias replied. She handed him a small brass key. It was old, warm from her pocket. "Caleb's," she said. "He used it for the maintenance hatch. I think it belongs to you now." Elias turned the key over in his palm, feeling the grooves worn smooth by another man's persistence. "I didn't fix it alone," he said. Mara met his eyes. "No," she agreed. "But you stayed." The bell rang an hour later, once, clean and deliberate, not a call to worship or work, just a reminder that morning had arrived and intended to be acknowledged. People paused when they heard it, not all of them. Some kept walking, already accustomed. Others looked up, smiled faintly, and moved on. The bell was becoming ordinary again, and that was its greatest success. Sheriff Ann Morales crossed the square with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a folded notice in the other. She stopped in front of Elias and extended the paper. "Town council met last night," she said. "Unanimous vote. The tower's officially maintained again. They want you listed as caretaker." Elias hesitated. "That's a title," he said. "I've never been good with those." Morales smiled slightly. "It's mostly paperwork and a small stipend, enough to keep you from leaving for practical reasons." Mara watched him carefully. So did Ash. Elias folded the paper once, then again. "All right," he said. "But I'm not promising miracles." Morales chuckled. "Nobody's asking for those anymore." Weeks passed, then months. The tower required attention, not obsession. Elias learned its moods the way some men learned weather patterns. He knew which days demanded oil and which needed patience. He rang the bell each morning at the hour, not because the town required it, but because he did. It gave shape to his days. It reminded him where he was meant to stand. Jonah Pike never returned. Word came eventually that he'd moved south, chasing opportunity that ran faster than he could. No one missed him. Towns remembered effort longer than ambition. Tom Calder stopped by often, sometimes to help, sometimes just to stand beneath the tower and listen. Lucas grew steadier, his hands surer. Ben Holloway retired quietly and took to carving small wooden toys for the children. His stooped shoulders finally allowed rest. Ash claimed the tower steps as his domain. He grew older there, muzzle whitening, movements slower, but no less purposeful. He followed Elias everywhere, a shadow with teeth and loyalty. Holler aged too, his pace measured, his strength conserved wisely. Elias adjusted his life around them both without resentment. One autumn afternoon, as leaves skittered across the square and the air smelled of distant snow, Mara joined Elias at the tower. She carried a small box wrapped in cloth. "I found something," she said. Inside the box lay Caleb's old pocket watch. The glass had been replaced. The hands moved freely now. "I thought it should keep time again," Mara said, "even if no one's looking." Elias nodded. "Time's funny that way." She smiled, a real one, unguarded. "I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore," she said quietly. "Neither do I," Elias replied. The bell rang again that evening, marking nothing more significant than the end of day. Children laughed nearby. Someone played music from an open window. The tower did not dominate the town. It belonged to it. Years later, travelers would pass through Santa Fe and notice the clock tower without knowing why it felt important. Locals would tell them it had always been there, that it worked, that someone took care of it. They would point to Elias Crow, older now, beard threaded with gray, posture relaxed, eyes calm. "He keeps the time," they'd say. Elias never corrected them, because what he kept was not hours or minutes, but something quieter, the agreement between people and place, the understanding that staying was not failure, and that ordinary mornings, repeated with care, could become a life worth choosing. And every morning, when the bell rang once against the open sky, Elias Crow stood beneath it, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had finally arrived. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, like a clock that starts moving again, like a heart that learns how to stay. This story isn't really about a tower, or a cowboy, or even time itself. It's about how God works when no one is watching, how He places broken things in our path, not to test us, but to invite us to listen, to care, to love again. In our daily lives, we pass by many silent towers. People who feel forgotten, animals who wait without understanding why, moments we believe are already too late. But God reminds us, nothing is truly frozen when love is willing to stay. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who feels alone today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters here. And if stories of hope, kindness, and quiet faith mean something to you, please subscribe to this channel so we can continue walking these journeys together. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He protect every child, every animal, and every weary soul watching this. And may you never forget, even the smallest act of care can become a miracle in His hands. Amen.